What happens when a television legend sits down for what should be a simple interview, but instead finds herself defending her entire career against accusations she never saw coming? Well, you're about to witness one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. And trust me, you won't believe how this unfolds. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this story gets absolutely wild. Marla Gibbs, the beloved actress who captured hearts as Florence Johnston on The Jeffersons and Mary Jenkins on 227, walked into the studio that morning expecting nothing more than a warm, celebratory conversation. At 92 years old, she'd done hundreds of interviews and figured she had seen every kind of question a host could throw at her. The producers had contacted her team about discussing her recent memoir and reflecting on her groundbreaking roles. It was supposed to be light, nostalgic, and full of respect for a woman whose work shaped generations of viewers. Backstage, Sherri greeted Marla with admiration and warmth. The two women chatted briefly about their shared experiences in the industry, and Sherri expressed how much Marla's characters had inspired her growing up. Everything seemed perfectly normal as they made their way onto the brightly lit set. The studio audience cheered loudly when Sherri announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Marla Gibbs." Marla, dressed elegantly in a powder blue blazer and pearls, waved graciously and settled into her chair, her smile radiating the same charm she'd shown on screen for decades. The interview began innocently enough. Sherri asked about Marla's early struggles as a black actress in the 1970s and how she landed her iconic role as Florence. Marla shared stories about auditioning for the Jeffersons, never imagining that her character would become such a lasting cultural force. She talked about Florence's quick wit, sharp humor, and refusal to let anyone, even her employers, diminish her dignity. Sherri nodded along at first, praising Marla's trailblazing career. But then, almost without warning, the tone shifted. "There's been a lot of discussion lately," Sherri said, leaning forward, "about whether certain roles from that era, roles like Florence, played into harmful stereotypes." The audience grew quieter. Marla's expression tightened just a bit. She had been down this road before. She answered carefully, emphasizing the importance of historical context and the power Florence held despite being written as a maid. But Sherri pressed harder, suggesting that Florence's sassiness and employment by a white family reinforced outdated depiction. It was clear now, this wasn't going to be the soft, celebratory interview Marla had been promised. And as Marla straightened in her chair, preparing to defend her life's work, the atmosphere in the studio shifted from excitement to tension that would only escalate. As the interview continued, Marla maintained her composure as Sherri questioned whether Florence, despite her strength, contributed to stereotypes. The younger host continued pushing, implying that Florence's role as a domestic worker was a step backward for representation. Marla calmly countered that Florence wasn't simply a maid. She was the smartest and most outspoken character on the show. She reminded Sherri and the audience that Florence consistently challenged George Jefferson, never hesitated to speak her mind, and often delivered the most memorable lines. But Sherri didn't let up. She questioned whether making audiences laugh at a black domestic worker helped reinforce harmful social norms. She argued that Florence's humor allowed viewers to avoid confronting the real inequalities black women faced. The tension in the room thickened, and even the studio staff looked uneasy as the interview veered further into confrontation. Marla pushed back firmly. She explained that Florence's position wasn't something to be ashamed of. The character was a tribute to working women with dignity, intelligence, and emotional depth. She reminded Sherri that millions of viewers connected with Florence because they saw their mothers, grandmothers, and sisters represented in her strength and resilience. However, Sherri's line of questioning became more personal. She revealed that her own grandmother and aunt had been domestic workers, and that seeing characters like Florence had embarrassed her at times. That confession shifted the conversation. Marla softened slightly, recognizing the personal hurt behind Sherri's critique. But she also clarified that the shame Sherri felt wasn't caused by Florence, it was caused by the societal conditions that devalued the work of black women. Still, Sherri insisted she wasn't attacking Marla, but simply examining how those images looked through a modern lens. Marla disagreed, pointing out that reducing her characters to stereotypes without acknowledging their complexity was exactly what critics had done decades earlier. She accused Sherri of echoing dismissive, surface-level interpretations without engaging with the full episodes or storylines. The audience grew completely silent as the back and forth intensified. Viewers in the room seemed divided, some nodding toward Marla's perspective while others looked empathetic toward Sherri's personal experiences. What had begun as a simple interview about a memoir was now unraveling into a deep, emotionally charged debate about representation, generational perspectives, and the way Black women see themselves reflected in media. By now, the interview had transformed into a clash of philosophies. Sherri argued that Black women deserved better roles, more complex, more varied, less tied to historically limiting occupations. Marla agreed that better roles were necessary, but insisted that acknowledging progress should never involve tearing down the trailblazers who made that progress possible. She emphasized that every step forward in representation came from artists who pushed the boundaries available to them at the time. Sherri countered that they needed to be honest about the impact those earlier portrayals had on future generations. But Marla questioned whether Sherri was truly being honest or simply repeating modern critiques without understanding the context. She reminded Sherri that Florence wasn't written as comic relief for white audiences, but as a grounded character with agency, humor, and heart. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't meek. She challenged authority in ways few characters, Black or white, were allowed to do in that era. The audience watched as Sherri's confidence began to falter under Marla's steady, impassioned responses. Marla then asked Sherri directly whether she had watched full episodes recently. Sherri hesitated. She admitted she hadn't watched the shows in full, but felt familiar enough to form an opinion. Marla seized on that point, arguing that meaningful analysis required deeper engagement and that Sherri's critiques lacked the nuance necessary to evaluate Florence's true impact. Sherri tried to regain control, insisting she wasn't attacking Marla personally. But Marla responded that the entire interview felt like a trial, with her placed on the defensive for choices she made decades ago under vastly different circumstances. She reiterated that Florence and Mary Jenkins were beloved figures, not embarrassments, and that countless viewers saw themselves represented with dignity for the first time. Sherri's frustration grew more visible, and her tone sharpened as she pushed back. She insisted that examining old portrayals was essential to understanding modern representation. But Marla maintained that criticism must come from a place of informed understanding, not from assumptions or modern judgments alone. The emotional weight of the conversation intensified. Sherri revealed that her embarrassment over characters like Florence came from her own upbringing, growing up around family members who worked in domestic roles and wishing society viewed them with more respect. Marla listened carefully, but pointed out that Florence was never the problem. The problem was a society that undervalued honest work and dismissed the humanity of the women doing it. The exchange was raw, powerful, and deeply personal, leaving the audience unsure whether they were witnessing a necessary conversation or watching a painful generational divide unfold in real time. Marla took a deep breath and continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She reminded Sherri that working women, domestic workers included, deserved respect, visibility, and rich stories. And that was precisely what her characters brought to television. Florence and Mary were crafted with depth, humor, agency, and strength. They weren't caricatures. They were complex reflections of real Black women navigating their lives with resilience. Sherri conceded that those roles opened doors, but she insisted that it was still necessary to critique them. Marla countered that it was possible to critique without diminishing a legacy. She accused Sherri of undermining her contribution to Black media history by framing Florence as harmful instead of groundbreaking. She explained that representation isn't measured solely by a character's job title, but by how fully realized that character is, and Florence, she argued, was one of the most fully realized Black women on television at the time. Sherri attempted to steer the interview back toward a more neutral ground, but the emotional intensity remained. Marla spoke with a quiet force that commanded the room. She emphasized that every portrayal, maid, mother, lawyer, CEO, matters when crafted with respect and humanity. She called out the classism inherent in suggesting that service roles are inherently undignified. Marla's own mother had worked in domestic service, and she insisted those women's stories were just as worthy of being told as any other. The studio fell into complete stillness as Marla voiced her disappointment. She told Sherri that instead of celebrating the bridges she built, the interview had focused on questioning whether those bridges were even worth crossing. She pointed out the danger in dismissing older portrayals without acknowledging the limitations of the time and the courage it took to push against them. Her characters weren't tokens, they were icons. Sherri, visibly shaken, tried to explain that her intention was to explore how media evolves. But Marla insisted that evolution shouldn't erase history or shame the women who carried earlier generations forward. She reminded Sherri that her platform gave her the power to uplift the next generation. Yet doing so by undermining the previous one was not progress. The audience watched, transfixed, as the emotional divide between the two women played out not just as a disagreement about a character, but as a debate about identity, legacy, pride, and the multifaceted experiences of Black women in America. As the segment neared its end, Marla's final words lingered in the air, firm, graceful, and impossible to ignore. She urged Sherri to honor the past while building the future, not by tearing down what came before, but by understanding it, respecting it, and recognizing the doors it opened for everyone who walked through after.